All right, we're back. This is episode 579. Tonight's show is called Petrus Romanus, the final pope in the Annunciation of the Antichrist. And let's get our guests back on. Stand by. Steve, Chris, Tom, do I have you back on the line?
I'm here.
That's Chris, Steve?
Yeah, I'm here.
And Tom. I'll give it back to you, Steve. Take it over.
So, Chris, go ahead and share how you found the document that has basically been lost to history.
Well, certainly, Steve. When we first started looking into the prophecy, one of the biggest books in recent history is called The Last Pope, and it's by John Hogue. And John Hogue's a regular on Coast to Coast, and
Hey, by the way, you're walking away from your mic again, Chris.
I don't know. I'm right up on it. I don't know.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now you can. So you
okay.
must. I don't know if you're turning your head or something.
All right. Well, John. So I went ahead and purchased a copy of Hogue's book, The Last Pope, and read it thoroughly. As one of the starting points of my research. And Hogue mentions that there was once this book called La Profezia La Somni Pontifica Romani in Italian from 1794 that perhaps, mentioned an earlier manuscript of the prophecy before it was published in 1595. But, he goes on to lament that the book was burned up when a certain convent was burned up, and I just took the name that he quoted for the book and typed it into Google. Okay, so it really wasn't that hard, but it pops up in a world catalog, and it only showed up in the Netherlands. Okay, and it wasn't even really clear that the book existed. It just showed on this world catalog site that the Netherlands had something about it. So I contacted this library in the Netherlands and started emailing them. It turns out they did have a copy of it, but I really couldn't get a hold of it. And then I went through interlibrary loan at my university, and they started trying to find it. And it turns out that they had a copy of it at Yale. And so I ended up getting scans of the book. And, it contains some of the things that what Hogue was hinting at with this old manuscript. He kind of had his facts messed up. It really wasn't at a convent, but it was at a monastery that mentioned that they might have had a copy of it. Now, what does that do? Well, it shows that the prophecy is older than 1595 is one thing. And, I've done a lot of research on the origin of the prophecy and what part is real and what part has probably been altered. And, one of the most astonishing books that I found was actually not this lost book. This lost book did have some evidence pointing to this older manuscript, which is important because it helps us to establish when the authentic part of the prophecy starts. But I found another book by a Jesuit that Tom had mentioned earlier, René Thibaut, and he published his book in 1951. Now, this book is much more astounding. It's got a lot of cryptography. He takes apart the Latin text of the prophecy, and he found all kinds of encoded cryptograms with dates and messages and years. Now, there's a lot of details that I really can't get into just on this cast that you'll have to read in the book, but through a lot of investigation into the layers of context in the prophecy, we've detected that probably the original part of the prophecy started around 1570, okay, which is 20 years before most of the scholars you're going to read about. If you go read the Wikipedia page, it's going to say 1595. But there's really good reasons to believe that we have a copy of this thing around 1570, and that from 1570 until now is the original context of the prophecy. Now, what happened is what Tom alluded to before, is that it looks like some people went in and changed some of the prophecies to make them fit some of the textbooks that people had available to them in the 16th century, and probably to influence an election of a certain pope. And there's some kind of conspiracy going on there, and we can tell that they altered some of it. But they had no reason to alter the part in the future because, you're dealing with all the way up until now. You're talking about in the 16th century. So obviously they had no agenda for what happened this year. But the thing that's really amazing about René Thibaut's work is that he calculated the average papal reign okay, how long a pope has office. Now, he was writing in 1951, and Thibaut died.
Chris,
yes?
Excuse me one second. Hold that thought. I'm going to reset your connection. Okay.
Sure, and I'm not, of course, I'm not the discoverer of what I think is one of the highlights in the investigation of this book, which Chris Putnam is. But this book, what people are going to learn, they're going to love this book in another way, in that this is almost like an episode of, who's that guy that discovered, in the movies, the Ark of the Covenant and all that, because we go from the moldy corridors in forgotten libraries in Europe to the Sheriff's Department in Dane County, Wisconsin, and finally discovering out-of-print, extremely rare book written in French entitled The Mysterious Prophecy of the Popes that was published in 1951, where Chris was fortunate enough to track down one of the last remaining copies of this 60-plus-year-old manuscript and to work diligently to translate it into English.
Tom,
and what you
excuse me one second, please. Excuse me 1 second. Chris, Steve, do I have you back online?
I'm on. Can you hear me?
Hey, while we're waiting for Steve, I want to make sure I don't forget to ask you, gentlemen, what were the 2 coins that you mentioned earlier in the program that the Masons gave you to protect?
Well, that was given to me actually 2 years ago when I went to Washington, D.C. It was set up through a governor who got me a private meeting. I took my wife with me. She was there with me. And we met with 2 of the members of the Freemasons, the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, at the headquarters there at the Herodome in Washington, D.C., and that was an extraordinary meeting in which I asked them some very particular questions having to do with whether or not every time a United States president is elected, they conduct the raising of Osiris ceremony inside the Herodome to instill within every U.S. president the spirit of Osiris in anticipation of the day when Osiris, and who is known to the Greeks as Apollo and in the New Testament as the Antichrist, will come in fulfillment of the prophecy of the Cumae Sibyl that's upon the Great Seal of the United States. I asked them a lot of other questions. They were very helpful until I asked that question, and then they wouldn't answer me. But they gave me 2 coins, which I at first didn't really want to take. But then before I left, I took the coins, and immediately I contacted an ex-Freemason who is a friend of mine. And I asked him what the 2 coins were about, and he told me something about that being really old-school Freemasonry, in which they would give you these coins in order so that you could present them in case you were threatened, and they would accept you as being, even though you're not a Freemason, they would allow you basically to live. It was really old-school Freemasonic craft. Those burnt up in the house that I own that burned down this last year. So, are we still on?
I've got you and Chris on. We're going to bring Stephen, I think, by telephone. Chris, pick back up where you left off before I had to refresh your connection.
Okay, so you were able to hear what I was talking about with René Thibaut and the encrypted codes in the book. Was that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, yeah, picking up on that, so we have this book that I found. And all the research I did, there's a lot of books written about the prophecy of the popes that the general public is not aware of. Now, the thing is, most of these are by Catholic scholars, and most of them are European, so they're not in English, okay? There's a lot of books in Italian. There's books in French. And this one that I found, The Mysterious Prophecy of the Popes, by René Thibaut, it's all written in French. He's a Belgian Jesuit, and he worked at a university, and he really believed the prophecy of the popes. Okay, he believed it deeply, but he believed the original underlying level of context. So what we think we have an ancient prophecy. Maybe it was written by Malachi, maybe it wasn't. Nobody can really know for sure about that because we just don't have any evidence going all the way back to Malachi other than kind of the legendary story. But what we do have is we have this document. Now, we can detect that there were alterations made prior to 1570. The way we can detect that is that there was a famous book by Panvinius, who was a scholar who wrote a papal history about all the popes. Now, he made some errors. He made some mistakes in his book. Now, this was like the source material for the papacy during that time, during the 16th century. Now, what we see in the Malachi prophecy is that in the prophecies up to 1590, somebody went and wrote an interpretation next to the Latin phrase. Now, they wrote who the Pope was, how it was fulfilled, and what the fulfillment was. Now, what they did, it's a dead giveaway, is that they made some of the same mistakes as Panvinius' book. Now, this kind of shows us that somebody manipulated the prophecy to make it fit that book. Now, why would they do that? They were trying to make it really obvious so that any cardinal that tried to investigate the prophecy for himself would be able to look at this source material and then look at the reference book that he would have available, which would be Panvinius' book, and he would find an exact match. So it looks like someone manipulated the text prior to 1570 to do that as an effort for propaganda, and that we think that they were trying to get a certain pope elected. Okay, but after that date, then there's no reason that anyone would ever alter it because it was way into the future. So we can really believe that we have this underlying authentic text that goes from that date forward. So René Thibaut really presents a lot of good arguments for why 1570 is the cutoff point. Now, if you go to Wikipedia or read John Hogue or any of the more modern people, they're going to say that it was 1595 because that's when we have the first copy in hand that was published by Arnold D. Wyan. But so 1570 is where we start the original text, and that's the date that I'm going with because the arguments for that are pretty strong. Now, what Thibaut did is he figured out average papal reign up to his time in 1951 when he published this book, and it was 11 years. And what he did, all you have to do to prove that to yourself is you just take how many days the Pope was in office and divide it by the number of popes, and you get the average papal reign. Now, from 1570 to the last Pope, the 112th, you have a certain number, and so you have a calculation, and if you put 11 years for each one, where do you land? Well, René Thibaut calculated it in 1951 and landed on 2012. Okay, and all the things that Tom said about 2012. You have all these weird prophecies. You have the Mayans. All the New Agers are talking about 2012. I've been skeptical about 2012 myself in the past because it just seems like all these pagans and New Agers and all this kind of stuff. I didn't really want to buy into it. But there's some reason why all these people are coming on the same thing. And then we get into this research, and it's the last thing I expected. I find
Chris, while we're waiting on Steve to get back on the line.
Steve, you back with it? Okay.
Yep, I'm back.
Yes.
Well, while we were waiting on Steve, and thank God you're back, Steve. Man, the ship needs a captain. But we were talking about this book by René Thibaut. He's a Belgian priest. His book is a meticulous analysis of the prophecy of the popes. In our book, we provide as much of his background as can be known, the fact that he was Belgian-born, when he was born, the fact that he was a Jesuit in the order in something like 1901. Later on, he was an instructor at the faculty of the University de Namur, which is founded by the Jesuit order in 1831, and so on. But this was a guy, he was an academic. He published books on theology, biblical studies in French, and several, the meaning of Christ's words was one he published, the meaning of the God-man was one. But what we look at is a book that he published. It was a codex. He was a code breaker. And he published this work just before he died. The book was published in 1951, and he died at 69 in Egenhoven, Belgium in 1952. So he died right after it was published. But what he did, and what Chris found, was that this Jesuit adopted the methodology of a Catholic mystic, as well as being a scholar and a mathematician and a code breaker. And his book makes this compelling case that the prophecy of the popes is a real prophecy regardless from what source it was inspired, demonically or divinely. And he approaches his study from this real complex, what Chris said, mathematical, cryptographical,